Amid the unrelenting aggression by Israel, Washington is now working to coordinate a multinational effort to set up a maritime aid corridor into Gaza. This is a part of a U.S. strategy of flooding the zone with humanitarian aid. To talk more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Malcolm L. Davis, Senior Analyst in Defense Strategy and Capability at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Davis.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Right, Dr. Davis, now Washington has proposed for a maritime corridor for Gaza, a part of a U.S. strategy of flooding the zone with humanitarian aid. What is your assessment of this corridor, and do you think it is realistic to achieve at this moment?
Look, I think they're clearly going to try. What they're going to use is a capability called JLOTS, or Joint Logistics Over the Sea, where basically they have a floating wharf that is assembled and ships can come, dock at the wharf offshore, pick up the aid, go back and deposit the aid ashore, where it's supposedly or assumedly distributed by international aid organizations operating in Gaza. There's no hint at this point in time that the US is planning boots on the ground in Gaza. I think that would be a huge mistake. My only concern with this process, well, two concerns really, is that the floating wharf, the JLOTS capability, will be vulnerable to attack by forces such as Hamas and Hezbollah in Iran. And secondly, once the aid gets ashore, how do we control where it goes? How do we ensure that it goes to the people who need it the most, as opposed to the Hamas fighters?
Right, and just a follow-up to that statement you made there, that the U.S. are clearly not really favouring delivering aid through the sea, because we've seen in the past occasions that those boxes of food and the aid, they reached the Hamas militants instead of the Gazans there.
That's correct, and I think that once the aid goes ashore, the plan is that international aid organizations such as the International Red Cross and Red Crescent will try to distribute the aid to the Gazans, but it's Hamas that have the guns. And so I think that the risk is that Hamas will simply confiscate the aid for themselves. It's in their interests, Hamas's interests, to see the Palestinians suffer, because then that puts more pressure on Israel to stop the war. So there is a risk that Hamas will exploit this and try to use the aid as a weapon, if you like, to try and put pressure on Israel.
Right. Dr. Davis, what are the ways and means through which this way in which Hamas is exploiting the aid, how can that be averted?
Well, it can only be averted if we have protected aid corridors ashore. And that means US boots on the ground, which the Biden administration is clearly not prepared to do, because the moment you have US troops ashore, they will come under direct attack from Hamas, and you'll have US casualties, or you have US service people being captured and held hostage. And that would be political disaster for Biden in an election year where he's already looking rather weak in terms of his competition against Trump. So I think that there's no real way to protect the aid once it goes ashore. We just have to hope that it actually gets to the people who need it the most.
Right, but there's also growing pressure, not just in Israel, but also in the United States of America, regarding the hostages who are still captive. And of course, the plight of the Gazans. At least 31,000 Gazans have been killed in the ongoing war. And you speak of how Biden and the White House are extremely against sending U.S. troops inside Gaza.
That's correct. The hostages, I think, are going to be the subject of an ongoing diplomatic negotiation. It's anybody's guess as to how many of those hostages are still alive, or where they are, or who controls them. It's possible they could have been moved out of the region entirely to some different location, held by some different group. So the hostages are a really uncertain prospect in terms of how we get them back. You see protests in Israel saying, return the hostages, return the hostages. Well, that's up to Hamas to decide to do that. The Israelis ultimately can try to rescue hostages, but there's no way that the hostages will be returned if Hamas choose not to return them. The 31,000 Palestinians killed is tragic, and I do think that Israel do need to actually think about how they use military force in a way that reduces the risk of further casualties, particularly if they go into Rafah. But Hamas is also using those Palestinians as human shields. It's in their interest to see high casualties. And in terms of boots on the ground, as I said, the moment US troops set foot ashore, they come under direct threat of attack or capture. And that's why the Biden administration won't go down that path.
Right, Dr. Davis, the aid which is being delivered into Gaza is very minuscule. US has been urging Israel to allow more aid into Gaza. Meanwhile, there's sort of blame game going on here. Israel has blamed UN for the lack of aid distribution in the Gaza Strip.
And certainly there is concerns that the aid isn't being distributed effectively. As I said, Hamas can be taking a lot of the aid, and the actual physical logistical mechanism for actually getting the aid to where it is needed is very unclear. So I think there are real problems on the ground. But after all, we are talking about operating in a war zone here in a densely populated region that is basically quite small in size, but incredibly populated, under fire from Israeli forces. So it's very difficult to get aid through to those who need it the most.
Right, Dr. Davis, thank you so much for taking our time and joining us here on WION yet again.
Thank you very much.